Most people beg, argue, or try to explain their pain to a narcissist, and it never works. But here's the shocking truth. The more you chase an apology, the less likely you are to ever get one. Yet there is a psychological shift that sometimes forces a narcissist to apologize. Not because they suddenly become empathetic, but because their own ego demands it. Before we dive into the key strategies, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you're interested in understanding the psychology behind narcissistic behavior. The more you understand these patterns, the less power they have over your life. One of the most powerful shifts you can make when dealing with a narcissist is to stop chasing the apology you believe you deserve. Most people assume that if they just explain their pain clearly enough, the narcissist will eventually understand and take responsibility. But narcissistic psychology works very differently. When you repeatedly demand an apology, you unintentionally give the narcissist control of the emotional dynamic. They begin to see your need for validation as leverage, not as something that requires empathy. The more you push, the more defensive or dismissive they become, because refusing to apologize reinforces their sense of dominance in the interaction. What changes the situation is emotional withdrawal from that pursuit. When you stop asking, stop arguing, and stop trying to prove how much they hurt you, the entire dynamic shifts. Suddenly, the narcissist loses the emotional reaction they were expecting. Instead of feeling powerful, they begin to experience uncertainty. Narcissistic personalities rely heavily on predictable responses from others to maintain their sense of control and superiority. When those responses disappear, it disrupts their psychological comfort. In some cases, this disruption leads the narcissist to reconsider their position, not necessarily because they suddenly develop deep empathy, but because the lack of emotional engagement threatens their sense of importance and influence. If they perceive that they are losing your attention, respect, or connection, apologizing can become a strategic way to pull you back into the relationship dynamic. Ironically, the moment you stop needing the apology is often the moment when the narcissist becomes most likely to offer one. When dealing with a narcissist, one of the most disruptive things you can do is remove the emotional reaction they expect from you. Narcissistic personalities often thrive on emotional intensity. Whether it is admiration, anger, frustration, or tears, strong reactions reassure them that they still have influence over you. In many cases, conflict itself becomes a form of validation for them. If they can provoke you into defending yourself, explaining your feelings repeatedly, or reacting with visible pain, they feel powerful because they know they are still controlling the emotional temperature of the relationship. When you begin responding calmly and without visible emotional escalation, the pattern they rely on starts to break. Instead of arguing, raising your voice, or trying to force them to understand your hurt, you remain steady and composed. Your responses become shorter, more neutral, and less emotionally charged. This does not mean you are suppressing your feelings. It means you are choosing not to display them in a way that fuels the narcissist's sense of control. Over time, this calm detachment creates a psychological imbalance for the narcissist. They may try harder to provoke a reaction because the absence of emotional feedback feels unfamiliar and uncomfortable. When their usual tactics fail, they may start to reassess the situation. If they sense that their behavior is pushing you further away rather than pulling you into conflict, apologizing can sometimes become a way to restore the connection and regain their influence. In this way, emotional neutrality does something arguments rarely achieve. It quietly removes the reward they receive from hurting you. Setting a quiet boundary is one of the most effective ways to shift the dynamic with a narcissist. Many people assume boundaries must be loud, emotional, or confrontational to be taken seriously. But with narcissistic personalities, dramatic confrontations often lead to more arguments, denial, or manipulation. A quiet boundary works differently. Instead of trying to force the narcissist to admit they were wrong, you calmly communicate what behavior you will and will not accept moving forward. This might sound like a simple statement delivered without anger or hostility. You clearly express that certain actions, such as insults, dismissive comments, or disrespect, are not something you will continue to tolerate. The key is that the boundary is not framed as a threat or a demand for them to change immediately. It is simply a statement of what you will do to protect your own well-being if the behavior continues. What makes this powerful is the calm certainty behind it. Narcissists are often used to people reacting emotionally, arguing endlessly, or giving multiple chances without consequences. When you quietly state a boundary and then consistently follow through, the pattern changes. Suddenly, the narcissist realizes that their behavior now has real outcomes they cannot easily control. At that point, their usual strategies may stop working. If they sense that the relationship or connection is actually at risk, they may attempt to repair the situation in a way they normally would not. Sometimes that repair comes in the form of an apology, not necessarily because they feel deep remorse, but because acknowledging the harm becomes the quickest way to restore the stability they prefer. Protecting your self-respect is one of the most important psychological shifts when dealing with a narcissist. In many unhealthy dynamics, the person who has been hurt slowly begins to prioritize keeping the peace over protecting their own dignity. They may tolerate dismissive comments, excuses, or repeated hurtful behavior simply because they want the relationship to return to a calm state. Unfortunately, narcissists often interpret this tolerance as permission. When someone continues to accept disrespect without firmly valuing themselves, the narcissist learns that there are few real consequences for their behavior. When you begin to protect your self-respect, the dynamic quietly starts to change. This does not mean attacking the narcissist or trying to shame them. Instead, it means carrying yourself with a sense of inner certainty that you deserve to be treated with basic respect. Your tone becomes calmer but more confident. You stop over-explaining your feelings or trying to convince them that your pain is valid. You simply acknowledge your experience and stand by it without apology. Narcissists are highly sensitive to shifts in status and power within relationships. When they notice that you are no longer seeking their approval or validation, it can challenge the role they are used to playing. Your self-respect signals that the relationship will not continue under the same conditions as before. This can create an unexpected form of pressure for the narcissist. If maintaining the relationship still benefits them in some way, they may attempt to restore balance. In some cases, that restoration includes offering an apology because it becomes the easiest way to regain access to the connection they thought they controlled. Silence can be far more powerful than arguments when dealing with a narcissist. Many people believe that the only way to resolve hurt is to keep talking about it, explaining it, and pushing for acknowledgement. But with a narcissist, constant discussion often leads to the same exhausting cycle: denial, blame shifting, or turning the conversation back on you. The more the conversation continues, the more opportunities they have to manipulate the narrative or avoid accountability. When you allow silence to replace repeated arguments, something important begins to shift. Instead of continuing the emotional tug-of-war, you stop participating in the conflict. You are not ignoring the situation out of weakness. You are choosing not to engage in a pattern that leads nowhere. Your silence communicates that you have already said what needed to be said, and you are no longer interested in debating your own experience. For a narcissist, this silence can create an uncomfortable psychological space. They are often used to controlling conversations, provoking reactions, and steering the emotional energy of the interaction. When you step back and remove yourself from that cycle, the usual structure of the relationship disappears. They may begin to notice that their words are no longer pulling you into the same emotional responses. This lack of engagement can trigger curiosity, frustration, or even concern about losing influence over you. If they begin to feel that distance growing, they may attempt to reopen the connection. Sometimes the fastest way for them to do that is by offering an apology, not necessarily out of deep reflection, but because it helps break the silence and restore the interaction they relied on. Refusing to argue about reality is another powerful shift when dealing with a narcissist. One of the most exhausting patterns people experience in these relationships is the endless debate over what actually happened. You explain how their words or actions hurt you, and instead of acknowledging it, they deny it, minimize it, or twist the situation until the focus somehow turns back onto you. This creates a cycle where you feel forced to defend your own memory, your feelings, and even your perception of events. The problem is that narcissists often use these debates as a strategy to avoid accountability. By questioning your interpretation or insisting that you misunderstood them, they pull you into long conversations where the original issue slowly disappears. The more you try to prove your point, the more energy you invest in a conversation that rarely leads to resolution. When you stop arguing about reality, you remove the stage where this pattern usually plays out. Instead of presenting more evidence or trying harder to convince them, you calmly acknowledge your own experience and leave it there. You might say something simple and firm, such as explaining that you know what you experienced and that you are not interested in debating it further. Then you disengage from the discussion. This approach disrupts the narcissist's ability to control the narrative. Without the opportunity to argue endlessly, they lose a common defense mechanism. Over time, if they realize that denying the situation no longer pulls you into a fight, they may recognize that the easiest way to move forward is to acknowledge the harm in some way. In certain cases, that acknowledgement takes the form of an apology. Making a narcissist aware of their social image can sometimes influence how they respond after hurting someone. Narcissistic personalities are often deeply invested in how they are perceived by others. Their self-esteem is frequently tied to maintaining a reputation of being admirable, respectable, or in control. Because of this, they may care less about the private emotional damage they cause and more about whether their behavior threatens the image they present to the outside world. When hurtful behavior happens behind closed doors, a narcissist may feel comfortable denying it or minimizing its impact. They often assume the situation will stay private and that they will not face any consequences beyond the immediate conflict. However, when they realize that their behavior could affect how others see them, their priorities can shift quickly. Protecting their reputation becomes a powerful motivation. This does not mean exposing them publicly or trying to embarrass them. Direct humiliation usually leads to anger and retaliation rather than accountability. Instead, the shift happens when you calmly demonstrate that your perspective and boundaries exist in the real social world. When your response shows confidence and clarity, it signals that the narrative about what happened is not entirely under their control. If the narcissist senses that their actions could influence how they are viewed by friends, colleagues, or family members, they may begin to reassess the situation. In order to protect the image they value, they might attempt to repair the damage. Sometimes that repair appears as an apology, not necessarily because they suddenly feel deep empathy, but because acknowledging the harm helps restore the positive identity they want others to believe about them. Being prepared to walk away is the strongest psychological position you can have when dealing with a narcissist. Many people stay trapped in painful dynamics because they feel emotionally dependent on the relationship or deeply invested in making the other person understand the harm they caused. The narcissist often senses this attachment and may rely on it. When they believe you will always stay no matter how they behave, there is little incentive for them to change their actions or take responsibility for the pain they create. Everything begins to shift when you quietly reach a point where you are willing to move forward with or without their apology. This does not necessarily mean you immediately end the relationship, but it means your sense of stability and self-worth no longer depends on their response. You begin to prioritize your well-being and emotional safety over trying to fix the dynamic at any cost. Narcissists are often very sensitive to signs that they are losing control of a relationship. When they sense that your patience is running out and that you are genuinely capable of stepping away, it can challenge their sense of power. The connection they once assumed was secure suddenly feels uncertain. That uncertainty can create pressure for them to try to restore the relationship before it disappears. In that moment, apologizing can become a strategic way for them to pull you back and regain the stability they prefer. Again, the apology may not always come from deep emotional understanding, but from the realization that continuing the same behavior could result in losing access to you entirely. Ironically, the willingness to leave often creates the first real possibility for accountability. So here's the truth most people never hear. Getting a narcissist to apologize is rarely about finding the perfect words, the perfect argument, or the perfect emotional explanation. Those approaches usually fail because they appeal to empathy, and empathy is not the primary driver in narcissistic psychology. What actually shifts the dynamic is changing the structure of the relationship itself. When you stop chasing the apology, remove emotional reactions, set calm boundaries, and protect your self-respect, you quietly move out of the role the narcissist expects you to play. Instead of being the person who constantly seeks validation, you become someone who values their own reality and emotional stability. That change alone can disrupt the entire pattern the narcissist has relied on. Sometimes, when that disruption happens, the narcissist realizes that their usual strategies no longer work. The attention, control, or connection they once took for granted suddenly feels uncertain. In those moments, apologizing can become the simplest way for them to restore the relationship and regain a sense of balance. But there is something even more important than the apology itself. The real victory is the moment you stop needing it in order to feel whole. When your self-respect no longer depends on their acknowledgement, you reclaim your emotional independence. And ironically, that is the point where their words, whether they apologize or not, lose their power over you. because the real change was never about fixing the narcissist. It was always about strengthening the person they could no longer control.